Hashem. Okay, so let's continue in the parsha. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to the parsha. We're going to pick on one idea of one unusual expression that the Torah picks upon. And that is the expression that Moshe Rabbeinu uses when describing, it's actually a metaphor rather than an expression, when describing people, great people, people of great caliber. And just a little bit of background first of all. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu sent in spies with the permission of Hashem into the land of Israel to check it out. What does a spy do? A spy has got to figure out what the people are like, what the lay of the land is like, and he does that so that the people, the forces that are about to go into the land know exactly what they're dealing with. Are they dealing with a lot of people? A few amount of people? Are they dealing with well-fortified cities or non-fortified cities? Rashi actually tells us that better to find a city that is well-fortified, because that shows that the people inside are weak, as opposed to a city that is not fortified, which means the people inside feel very secure of their own powers. That's a very famous chazal on cities. And he obviously also wants to encourage the Jewish people to be excited about going into the land of Israel. And so he says, tell us when you get back, what's the land like? Does it give off a lot of fruits? Right? Is it fertile land? Obviously, because once the Jewish people enter into Israel, the whole manna thing is done. They're going to have to start planting their crops and sowing seeds and reaping and harvesting. So he wants to excite them by saying, look at the amazing fruits and vegetables that are in the country. And this description carries on, and it makes great sense. And then Moshe Rabbeinu asks the spies a very unusual question. And he says, figure out whether the land is shmena or razah, whether it's fat and good, or razah, it's thin and weak, and hayesh ba etz. Is there a tree? Not eitzim. Are there trees? Is there an etz, a tree in the land of Canaan, the future land of Israel? This is a very, very unusual expression, is it not? Is there a tree? Can anyone name a country in the world that doesn't have a tree? Can anyone name, maybe Antarctica, I guess, but besides that, most areas in the world have trees, especially in the Middle East. So obviously, this recommendation of finding a tree cannot be referring to a literal tree. It is a metaphor. So what does a tree represent? So trees in Torah represent people, great solid people. Just like we put roots into where we are living, so true a tree has deep roots. Just like a tree gives protection to those people who reside or sitting under it, so too we're meant to provide protection to other people. Just like a tree is beautiful to look at and does good for the world by producing its leaves and its fruits and its effect on the environment and the climate, so too we need to be the same thing. Adam ish sadeh, we are compared to a tree. So a tree is a very positive thing, which means that Moshe Rabbeinu was asking the spies to see if there is a good person. And that is the opinion of Rashi. Rashi, on the commentary, Hayesh Ba'etz, is there a tree? He says something quite astonishing. Im yesh behem Adam kasher. Is there an Adam kasher, a good kosher guy? Shiagin lehem, who is going to protect them, the Canaanites, bezchuto, in his merit. So we know that the tree is not literal. We know the tree is referring to a person, and not any person, but a very good person who has tremendous zchut. The only question we have left right now is it possible that one person living in Canaan, now Canaan in those days, Canaan always refers to the geographical location of the land of Israel. Once we enter in the Jewish year 2488 into Israel, it's never called Canaan ever again. It's always Eretz Yisrael. Always Eretz. At this point it's Canaan. And we know that there were 7 nations residing in that land. And we know those nations were really, really bad. They were the most corrupt nations in the entire world, possibly only secondary to the Egyptians at this point, but they probably learnt a lot of their ways and got involved in it. There was Avodah Zarah, there was Shfichat Damim, right? There was idol worship, there was murder, Gilead rights, sexual immorality. The place was terrible. And yet, Moshe Rabbeinu has a concern that one person, Adam Echad, Etz, not Eitzim, one person living in Canaan at that time has the ability to Yagin Alehem, to protect hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are living in that region. And not just any people, really bad people. And I'm going to double down on this. The people who he's protecting them against are the Jewish people who have their destiny to live in Israel, who have with them Moshe Rabbeinu, because at this point Moshe Rabbeinu is going into Israel. He's got Yoshua, he's got Caleb, he's got Miriam, the greatest heroes and heroines of Jewish history. How is this possible, my friends? Why is Moshe Rabbeinu concerned that one person can actually protect the worst people in the entire world? Because one person does something right. And the answer is going to have to be that kachava, it's possible. You can have a community, you could have city, you could have an entire country that is full of the worst people, but one person's actions are so good and so pure that they are able to fend off people who are incredibly great, who were given a promise by God that they're going to take over that piece of land to bring goodness to that land. That is the power that one tzaddik or tzedeket can actually have. Reminiscent actually of Noah. Noah, we know, was an ish tzaddik b'dorah. He was the only good person, and yet we know that his tefillot had the potential, he didn't fulfill it unfortunately, but had the potential to hold back the rains and the wiping out of the flood, holding back the flood. By the way, who exactly was this one individual? Was there such an individual? And the answer is, yeah. According to the Gemara in Bava Batra, there was such an individual that did actually reside, according to some opinions, in Canaan at that time. And his name was Eov, Job, he of the great suffering. According to the Gemara, he was not even Jewish. He was actually a Canaanite that lived in the land of Israel. Actually, his zchut, his merit was so great, my friends, that Hashem had to kill him in order to allow the Jewish people to come in. And that is actually why when the Meraglim spies went into Israel, Hashem did them a favor and made many, many funerals at that time so that they wouldn't be noticed. Among them was Eov, who died at that time. So when the spies were walking around, no one was too involved in like who's visiting town nowadays. They won't get noticed because they're doing funerals. But only he died on that day. There was a custom in Canaan in those days, the rabbis tell us, that people would leave their dead unburied and they would wait for a great person to die, and then they would all bury their people and their family members on the day of this great individual. So the day they went in was the day Eov died. So Hashem did us a favor and allowed Eov, who was a great tzaddik, to die on that day so that they wouldn't be noticed while they were schlepping around the land and visiting and touring it.
So wait, that the book of Job, I was under a lot of information that was written so much later, not because it's a story written later about something earlier, but then he lived later.
Yeah, it was written later by Moshe Rabbeinu most likely. Some say Moshe Rabbeinu made up the whole story. It was just a large metaphor, an analogy, story about why bad things happen to good people. Tzaddik v'ra lo. That's one opinion of the Gemara. Gemara says that whoever, and Rashi brings this down, and Rashi believes this to be true, it's actually a story written by Moshe Rabbeinu about Eov that lived in Canaan. So we know that one person can have even an unintentional effect upon many other people. So I told the story before, but I got to tell it again because I received a voice note last night. By the way, as a rabbi, we love voice notes. Phone calls, not such a big fan. But voice notes, voice messages, lovely. Why? Double speed. What a bracha for every rabbi. Right? Because "Hi, Rabbi, how are you?" I'm like, ×2. I'm waiting for the ×3 function to come onto my WhatsApp. Bezrat Hashem. Some people, you could just speed right through it. I listen to some shiurim, all right, on YouTube. You know there's a setting you can double up the speed on YouTube. That's a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's greater invention than YouTube itself. Anyway, this person did not speak slowly. So this person left me a message last night. It reminded me of a story when I was a bachur in yeshiva. Going back many years, I was a single guy, and I left my family to come study here in New York. And let's be honest, yeshiva food, not so good. Not so good yeshiva food, right? A little bit shvach. So what do? On Shabbat, you make up for it, right? You find a family that knows how to cook and makes good food on Shabbat. Happens to be that I went to a number of families, and sorry to say, but the food wasn't always so fantastic. I started eating in Ashkenazi homes, and I found this unusual habit of Ashkenazim to serve dessert during the meal. You'd have a nice piece of chicken, and they bring you like a sweet kugel thing, right? And I'm like, why are you giving me dessert together with my main meal? This was a revelation to me. Or they give you carrots, which are sweet enough, and they'd add sugar and cinnamon to the carrots. Timmus, they call it. I'm like, this is not going to work. So I found an Sephardi woman, Chani Simmons, and she made the most amazing food, and her husband was Ashkenazi, and I found this family, and that was it. I stuck to the family. I used to turn up every Shabbat uninvited for years when I was single, until Baruch Hashem I got married to an Ashkenazi who's now Sephardi, so she makes me good food. Anyway, so I used to go to them, and I was sitting with the father one day. I said, "Tell me your story," the husband of this family. I said, "Tell me the story. How did you?" Because I heard he was a Baal Teshuvah. How did you come to listen to this amazing story? This is like you can make a movie out of this. So he told me that he had gone to college. He was a secular Jewish boy from Long Island, and he'd gone to college, and he went to Harvard Law School, and he graduated Harvard Law School back in the 70s. This is when they actually studied at Harvard Law. Anyway, so he went over there, and he graduated, and he wanted to take a year off to go travel. They want to go travel and visit these different countries. So he told me one Shabbat, this is going back 25 years ago, he told me this, that he's traveling around the 1970s, and he goes here and he goes there, and he went to Thailand, all right, with a backpack, and he had the long hair and the beard, and he turns up in the airport, and he sees some kid sitting there in the airport in Thailand, cross-legged, meditating for hours, and he's like, "Oh man, dude, that's so cool," It's the 1970s, for goodness sake. So he approaches this guy. He says, "Excuse me." He was an American kid. And he says, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm meditating." He goes, "Well, where'd you learn to do that?" So he says, "I went to the top guru. This guy is the best guru you can go to. Don't go to anyone else. Go to him. He's going to teach you how to meditate." And he wrote down an address on a piece of paper, and he gave it to him. So this guy who had arrived there goes, "I'm going to go find it." So he goes outside, and he sees a button. He goes, "Excuse me, how do I get to?" And the guy starts laughing, like, "You got a long journey ahead." He goes, "But start on this bus." And he gets on this bus, and this bus travels for hours and hours and hours, and it reaches the end of his journey, and he's the only one left on the bus. He gets off, and he has to get another bus, and now he's in the middle of Yehupitzville, as we call it, which is just outside the Bronx, miles away from anywhere else. Eventually, he's like in the middle of a field, middle of nowhere, doesn't know where he is, and he sees a guy on a motorbike, those little putt-putt motorbike things in Thailand. He says, "Excuse me, I'm looking for this." And he goes, "Oh, that's over there." And he points at some trees far, far off in the distance. So he goes, "Don't worry, I'll take you." He gets on the back of this moped. He sees the moped, no helmet. They're wearing like flip-flops. And he gets on, he tells me. And he starts driving off, and they're going. It's like there's no road. It's all crazy terrain. And he says he gets this tree line, and the bike literally speeds, and he thinks he's going to hit a tree. In between these trees, to the most beautiful opening he'd ever seen in his life. And there, before him, stood tons of huts on stilts, and I think water, most beautiful scene he'd ever seen. And he says, "This is what you're looking for." So he walks in, and he sees some people just walking around with their, their robes on. He says, is this? And he goes, this is the place. He goes, I want to learn how to meditate. So they're like, no problem. You've got to shave your hair off. He says, look, this hair took me a long time to grow, right? My parents couldn't make me shave it off. My grandpa, you're not having me shave it off. He goes, no problem. You can stay, and you can stay with us for a few weeks, and you'll learn how to meditate. So he says he started, 10 minutes, and then 1 hour a day, and then eventually got up to hours and hours of meditating. After being there quite a while, one of the people in the ashram said to him, the head guru of the ashram wants to meet you. Now this supposedly was a big kavod, the head of the ashram wants to meet you, and he said he had to be prepped how to meet him. You can't just walk in, you've got to sit a certain way, you only speak when you're spoken to, when you sit, you've got to sit cross-legged, you can't have your toes pointing towards it, as all this mushagat, in order to give kavod to the great guru of this particular ashram. So he's ushered in, and there is a large auditorium, this big open auditorium, and he says there's tens of people sitting all around, all these, and they're all sitting cross-legged, and they bring him in. They bring him in, and he sees this head guru sitting on the front, kach, azoi, like a king. And he sits down in front of him, and he said the guy just stares at him, and stares at him, and he starts to get very nervous. He can't say anything. He hasn't been spoken to. And he sits calmly and quietly, and the guy stares at him. And he says, it's like an eternity. Mamash an eternity. And the guy looks at him, and he says to him with a completely perfect American accent, this guru, who are you? So he told him his name. My name is, I think his English name was Robert, I think. He goes, where are you from? He says, I'm from New York. He goes, where in New York? He says, I'm from Long Island. He goes, what have you been doing? He goes, I finished Harvard Law. I'm now traveling to experience the world a little bit. He goes, where are you traveling to? He goes, I'm here in Thailand. I want to visit the country. I want to go to the Middle East, maybe Europe. I'm spending the whole year traveling before I start working for some law firm. I want to enjoy myself. And the guru responds to him and says, I also was a Jewish boy from Long Island, and I also traveled around the world, and I came to this ashram just like you, and I started to study, and I started to meditate, and the head of the ashram absolutely loved me and said that one day you're going to become the head of this ashram. You're going to become the head guru. And I never, ever left. He says, but let me tell you something. There is an article I just read, and I've read this article, by the way, that Rolling Stone magazine had published, which you would never see today, and you can find this, I think, online. But I saw the original Rolling Stone magazine from the 1970s about a young boy from an irreligious family who had started studying and became observant and moved to Israel and became a rabbi. And he says, you're a good Jewish boy. Read this article, go to Israel, and go study over there. Don't stay here. This is not for you. Your roots are elsewhere. This is a true story. I heard this from the person it happened to, who's public about this story. He goes, go to Israel, go study. So obviously himself, this guy's completely crazy. What's he talking about? He finished his time in Thailand. He went to Israel. He went to the Kotel. He's picked up with a Friday night dinner, then another Friday night dinner. Then he hears about the yeshiva in the article. He went there. He didn't like it. He then found another yeshiva, which happened to be the yeshiva that I went to as well many years later. And I was studying when I met him, actually, in New York. And we became very, very good friends. He actually named my son at the Kriya, at his Brit Milah. And I went to him many, many, many times. And he was under my chuppah. And I was at his son's bar mitzvah. He just reminded me, he's a fully observant Jew. He's a lawyer here in New York. If you saw him on the street, you would never believe that that was his past. If you saw him, you think it's just any regular, religious Jew walking around Manhattan. That's his background. I pick on this story because sometimes, just like Eov, some people turn up at the right time, at the right moment and just say or do something that can have a massive effect, even affecting, in Eov's case, an entire country, but in this guy's case, generations and generations. He's now, Baruch Hashem, he's a father, obviously, he's a grandfather, and we see that one person in the most unlikeliest environments can have such an impact, like Eov, or like this Jew, Rahman Aslan, in this ashram, middle of Thailand, and make things and turn things upside down. Baruch Hashem, that's all it takes. Have a great and successful day. Xavier Matz.